Awesome. Welcome to today's special optional presentation, and this one is all about adaptation menus. And if you weren't here like just for the last couple of minutes, basically what we're going to do today is go into a few more details on what an adaptation menu is and why it's important and why we created them. And I'll then go into the forest menu and give you some background and context. And then we'll also talk about the tribal menu. And if anyone wants to learn about another menu, we'll do sort of a choose your own adventure look around. So feel free to put in tons of questions into the chat. I hope to break up the lecture to actually have some back and forth as well. So don't feel like you just have to listen to me put all this information on top of you today. Okay, so today, menus. I'm sure you remember the context of what it is that you're doing in the adaptation planning and practices course, but just as a reminder, really like menus were created in order to support this thought process of going from, you're on the ground, you have a project and you want to intentionally think about climate change and climate change risks, and you want to make climate informed actions so that you can reach your goals while considering climate change. Part of that is this, this idea that has come out of years and years of working with land managers across the Great Lakes and across the country and listening. And what we're hearing from folks is that they want a process that can support them as they're making customized considerations for their property. And when it comes to adaptation actions, they kind of just want the toolbox. They don't want somebody to give them rules or prescriptions or, a complex decision tree that will tell them what they need to do. So from our perspective at NIACS, we thought about this and we said, okay, how can we do this? How can we support land managers so that they can be, they can have the most flexible tool available to them while still staying, but while still being backed by the best available science and within their discipline of natural resource management. And so what we came up with was adaptation menus. Now, the adaptation menus really started in forestry. That was where we said, that's our niche. Let's grow that niche and let's sort of test the model and make sure that this worked for this community. Well, working in ecosystems provided this great opportunity to work with a lot of other people, more than just a forest planner type person. And what stemmed from that were these people who were very interested in using adaptation menus and were sort of forced to use the forestry menu. And so over the years, we saw people using the forestry menu to hardwire into their planning from a wildlife perspective, recreation perspective, a forested watershed perspective. And they were making it work, but it just really wasn't the best fit. And so we decided to expand that toolbox to more than just forests. And I'll go into more details in this presentation. So just to cut to the chase, we did put some links in the chat box, but I would really like it if you would go and explore these menus and start to get a sense of, skim through the longer version of these menus to get a sense of where are these approaches coming from and how are they connected to these natural resources disciplines? Why are they what they are? And so to do that, you would go to our website at forestadaptation.org, go to the top of the page, hit that adapt navigation item that's circled there, and you'll find a drop down that'll take you to these strategies. And this is what the page looks like. So, we'll go into more detail, but really if you tune out now and you decide to bail, all I want you to know is that we've expanded our toolbox to sort of be inclusive of a wide variety of perspectives and ideas. And this is where you can find the menus. Okay, so we have been going through the adaptation planning and practices course. Oh, and excuse me. And now we're at the adaptation, we're at step 4. And this is where we're going to, really exercise our brain and start thinking about how we're going to respond to climate change and all of the risks and vulnerabilities and challenges and opportunities that we have detailed up to this point. Step 4 is really all about flexibility. Like I said, we tried to create a toolbox that would support you in any direction that you were going, because we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what your project is. And so the adaptation menus really are akin to this idea of choose your own adventure. So let's look at these a little bit closer. What we're going to do today, this is really like sort of our table of contents. This presentation could go in 1,000 different directions, so I wanted to provide you some sort of agenda. I'm calling it the Tour d'Adaptation menu because I love the Tour de France, and this is kind of a fun way to think about it. So we're going to start with assessing, what is a menu? Why are they important? We're going to get into how are they built, and then I'm going to show you some examples. So let's start from the top. What is a menu? Well, Patricia talked about these ideas of adaptation concepts. And so when we start thinking about adaptation actions that we can take, we really need to sort of start up at this decision tree up at the top. Where are we going? We're driving a car, we're at an intersection. Where do we see ourselves, and what direction do we want to take our conservation and management? As Patricia described, and you'll also see in that video, we have several options on this continuum of reducing climate change impacts all the way to the left here, really trying to maintain current conditions at all costs, all the way to very forward-looking options that can promote change. And so just as a refresher, resistance, big, broad, we're talking in big, broad strokes here. Resistance options are all about approaches that can help us improve the defenses of that ecosystem and maintain relatively unchanged conditions. In a lot of ways, it's like thinking about your ecosystem with this bubble wrapped around it. You're not going to let anything change within that bubble. Next, we get into this idea somewhere in the middle of this continuum, where you're a little bit wishy-washy, you're a little bit more flexible with thinking about your ecosystem. And this is resilience. And what this means is that your ecosystem, which was wrapped in a bubble, now has some perforations. You're going to allow some change to occur. You're going to allow some impacts to come in there and change the system a little bit. But you're hoping to set that system up so that it can rebound, so that it can come back to what it once was in some way, maybe some character, some function. That's, still on that idea of reducing impacts, maintaining conditions, but allowing some change to occur. And on the other side of this continuum, we have transition. And these are ideas and approaches that will help to intentionally facilitate change and really align that ecosystem with climate change impacts or new trends, warmer conditions, more extreme precipitation. And that really is taking steps to promote a change in the ecosystem. So the adaptation menus help to take those big lofty ideas that are shown here in a cloud because they feel like a cloud. They feel so big and abstract. You can kind of understand what they are. Adaptation menus help to anchor those in a context of a natural resource discipline, forestry, forested watersheds. It helps to say, well, what do you mean by resilience? What do you mean by resistance? What would that look like in my sustainable forest management and conservation, as an example? And so a menu is really, it's a menu of adaptation menu of possible actions that allows you to decide what is most relevant for a particular location and set of actions by setting up this hierarchy. First, anchored by those adaptation concepts, and then it brings you all the way down to actions that are relevant in your resource discipline. So this is the mega list of adaptation menus that we have available. And you can see that, all these disciplines are thinking about the land, they're thinking about ecosystems, they're often thinking about vegetation or some sort of perennial or long-standing vegetation like trees or plants or shrubs. And although it might be the same forest, these are 1,000 different perspectives that are thinking about that forest or that ecosystem, and they're all relevant. Having this huge suite of adaptation menus provides an opportunity for a more inclusive roundtable of perspectives to come to the table when we're talking about that climate-informed planning into the future. And so, like I said, you can find these at our website. The link's in the chat, forestadaptation.org/strategies. Some of these menus are still in development, but you can check out the drafts. And you might even find some draft longer text that helps to support each of those menus as well. Okay, and so getting back to this idea of a menu, you know, adaptation menus, it's like just like at a restaurant, you know, you don't want to pick everything off of that menu, but you want to see what's available. You want to have the options so that when you come back to that restaurant, maybe you can choose something different based on your appetite, based on the weather, whatever. And so that's what we're setting up here. We're setting up this sort of a laundry list. It's a menu of many different possible approaches that you could take to respond to climate change. But we encourage you to pick and choose based on that project, based on what you think makes the most sense in order to meet your goals and objectives, and it applies to that specific location. So I sort of want to anchor this in saying, again, just really reinforcing this idea that menus include a myriad of ideas of adaptation options on that continuum from resistance, resilience to transition. And most importantly, and on purpose, adaptation menus include these key ideas of persistence, keeping that ecosystem pretty much the same in character and function, as well as presenting options that can help you transition that ecosystem and align it in a manner that's promoting change. So, you know, there are many paths forward to responding to climate change, and we don't want you to feel like you're boxed in. We're not trying to provide an agenda, and we're 100% not recommending a particular approach that you should follow. So again, these are menus of many different possible approaches that you might take. And so the adaptation menus play this really critical and important part in step 4 because they really do help to describe and support our intentions. You know, this whole process is about intentionality. And so the adaptation menus are the stepping stones that will help us get to the point of making our ideas specific and tangible on the ground. Okay, so now you know about menus. You kind of have an idea. They're clouds, right? No, adaptation menus are, again, anchored in those adaptation concepts and are relevant to a specific discipline. And they provide a myriad of ideas that you could choose. So if that was your elevator pitch, that's all you need to know. Okay, so let's get into why they're important. Well, Patricia talked about this a little bit in yesterday's lecture, and so I'm going to go into more details related to each of these big ideas. But first, adaptation menus, they can be a really interesting standalone tool. They're really critical for the adaptation workbook process because, again, we think that it helps to spell out the intentionality of your actions. But on their own, they're actually really cool resources. And so adaptation menus address several challenges that we all are experiencing when we're facing this challenge of climate change in our natural resource planning. The first idea is that they connect broad ideas to specific actions. You know, everyone's talking about resilience, resilience, resilience. And I want you to say to them, what is resilience? Make it specific. Tell me, connect the dots so that I can understand what that means in this conversation. I can understand how actions can be tangibly resilient or make an ecosystem resilient. Next, they help to make our actions intentional. Again, you know, we're drawing from, these are the stepping stones. We're drawing from these adaptation options. We're connecting them to our resources, forest management, forested watershed, those disciplines. And then we're scaling it down so that we're saying, I am taking these actions because it helps to support and maintain my ecosystem. You know, you can use the menus as a way to tell your story. And that leads me to number 3, which is all about communicating your ideas. It can be really hard to, you know, describe why a restoration has climate-informed actions or how it does. And so you can use the menu to sort of walk your ideas back up and trace those ideas because the menus are these really nice pithy statements. You know, the strategies are pretty short and the approaches are pretty short, and they can be used as the vehicle for helping to communicate your story. And lastly, there's so many ideas there. It's a great opportunity if you feel like you're kind of stuck. It's a great opportunity to, see how these tactics can play out by reading those examples within the adaptation menus. And it can really boost your creativity and maybe in a new and different way by reviewing not only a menu that you're pretty sure applies to you, but maybe you take a spin out into another menu and you find a whole nother really interesting resource. Okay, so let's go into some more detail. When I mentioned that adaptation menus help to connect broad ideas to specific actions. First, going back to that sort of that cloud image that I showed, I'm missing the cloud here, but these are those adaptation options. This is the hierarchy of our menus. Well, menus then draw in these ideas of strategies, which are bigger ideas that are a little bit more tangible than just an adaptation option on its own, like resilience. A strategy might actually go into more detail. Approaches are then scaled into even more discrete detail and often describe, a specific tangible idea related to an ecosystem or a part of an ecosystem. And then the tactics are something that we don't provide, but we encourage you to create on your own. This is that custom idea that you provide in your step 4. So you can see how they're all connected and creates that streamlined path to the actions that you have on the ground, making those concepts more specific to your tactic. Okay, so let's look at an example. If we were to say, I want to promote resilience, which I think everyone does. What does that mean? Well, you could scan through, let's say, the forest menu, and maybe you see strategy 4. And strategy 4 is all about maintaining or creating refugia. And this could be related to hemlock or a species that is geographically confined or works really well in certain situations, like hemlock really loves cold pockets. Well, maybe you're thinking about keeping hemlock going in those cold pockets and creating refugia so it's not exposed to the warmer temperatures. So that one speaks to you. Then you look down the list and you say, prioritize and maintain unique sites. You're like, yeah, totally. I've got these neat ravines. This is great. And then you come up with this tactic that you could manage north-facing slopes or property as cool conditioned islands for a northern tree species like hemlock. Maybe you'd retain all hemlock and promote hemlock regeneration in those places. So just backing up, if you just had this idea initially, this tactic, you could use the menu to connect your ideas up to those adaptation concepts by saying, well, I'm trying to prioritize these unique sites. And yeah, I guess I'm doing refugia. And wow, this is a resilience tactic. So you can look at the menu from several different angles. And we encourage you to do that, to use the menu to brainstorm ideas or to kick out your ideas and then connect it to the menu. Both ways work. Because menus are created to make your actions intentional. Really, it's all about connecting your goals, which are often tied to, the strategies that you'll choose, to your actions, which are often tied to those approaches and those tactics. It really is circular, and they are all connected. Next, adaptation menus are great to communicate your ideas, and we've sort of talked through that even right now. It's a great way to sum up what you're trying to do and kick out that elevator pitch. And I have seen a lot of people actually copy ideas from the menu and include those in their proposals or in their planning efforts as sort of that foundational idea for like a group to proceed. Like they'll take an approach and they'll say, well, in our invasive species program, we're going to do this, and they'll paste in an approach that seems to apply, and then provide their own example tactics as it relates to their organization. So feel free to use these in your work. These are tools that are just completely available for you to grab and choose and make sense of it in your own work as well. we have found that a lot of people enjoy the menus. You know, it's not just to say that we created this one day and we put it in a black box and we haven't heard from anybody. You know, we've been working with folks for several years to use these menus and adaptation tools, and we have almost 400, maybe I think more than 400 examples of people using the adaptation workbook and menus in their resource planning. So this is just a few of those examples, and hopefully we'll have your dot on here as well. And lastly, adaptation menus are all about boosting creativity. You might not think that a certain topic area applies, or you might not think that there's anything there for you outside of your core discipline, you know, but maybe you go to our website and you start looking at a different menu and you say, well, I'm a forester through and through, but you know you have an adjacent landowner who has some agricultural land. Take a look at the agricultural menu and see if there's anything in there that, you know, might help you spur on some ideas that you could integrate into your property. Or maybe you could talk to that adjacent landowner by drawing ideas out of the adaptation menu. So don't be afraid to use these and different permutations and in different ways, but definitely take a look at them because I think that you'll find some really interesting ideas in there. And every menu has example tactics as well. Okay, we are cruising on our little bike. Okay, so how are they built? How are these menus built? Do they just appear? Like, what is the process? And really quickly, it was just one slide. I sort of wanted to distill down the menu process into a basic recipe because when you, I'm sure any of you know this, when you try to replicate a project, they're never exactly the same. They always have a different flavor based on the participants and the collaborators who are part of it. But in its essence, we won't make a menu unless we have a pretty large need from the community. Like, we're not going to make it just because one person told us to do it. It has to be over several years. And we're not going to make a menu in isolation. We've only made, I think, like 2 menus in isolation, but all of the others have come from a very collaborative place working with partners. Every menu has an extensive literature review. There is a lot of adaptation, climate change and adaptation literature that's out there and has been put out there since the early 2000s. So there's a lot of ideas to draw from. And we read it all, we pull it all together, and then we have partners submit ideas and then they edit. And we use that as sort of our starting pool of information and helps us pull out major themes that maybe we want to include in the menu. After extensive vetting within our partnership and our inner circles of authors, we bring it to the real world and we bring it out pretty raw. Like, a lot of times it's like, please shred this document when you leave this workshop. Like, we're not sure this is a good idea. So we need you to tell us if you like it, if you don't like it, help us change the words, help us provide new tactics. And that vetting is so critical. We have, I've actually created new approaches when I brought this menu to the a water workshop because somebody brought a project and they said, there is nothing on here to help me get through this project. And so we had to create something. Then it goes into peer review. It's often like a blind peer review, and depending on where we're going to publish it, it might have an additional layer of peer review if it's in a journal or if it's at the Forest Service. And then it goes into a publication. And they're often published in either academic journals or like a Forest Service outlet, the USDA Climate Hubs, or an organizational outlet. Okay, so I'm going to use the opportunity to quickly segue into the forest menu. And basically, the forest menu and the urban forest menu are all found in this main document that we use to support all of our work, this forest adaptation resources. This forest adaptation resources was published twice, so there is a second edition that we usually have people refer I think the urban forestry menu and some really cool information on vulnerability assessments. But again, you know, when we created the forestry menu, it was all about synthesizing papers, reports, combining ideas, and drawing from, you know, the people in the community who were thinking about how adaptation could be applied in a forest setting. But this is really how it was created. This is the original document, which I think was published in 2010 or 11. No, was it 09? And then the second edition was in 12, I think. I don't know. Time is the vacuum. So just so you know, these were the originals. When we're looking at the forest menu, I just wanted to put a graphic in front of you that helped to describe that every strategy has a different focus, but that every menu really does go from resistance to transitional ideas. Some of these strategies are a combination. They're kind of in the gray zone between two different adaptation concepts, but I just wanted to put this out there that every menu can be sort of described visually in this way so that you can see some strategies are definitely more in that resilience transition zone, while others are more in that resistance resilience zone. The forest menu itself is the result of several years of work with foresters, and to be perfectly honest, it is a huge. This is reflective of what you are seeing in the menu, right? We're seeing a pretty honed in idea of vegetation and silviculture as it relates to climate change. You're really not looking too far outside of that box. And so, like I said, it's reflective of the community who helped to build it. But a lot of really interesting ideas here related to, getting the ecosystem back on track. Almost every strategy one in the menu is all about sort of almost a restoration idea of maintaining or sustaining fundamental ecological function. And then we, launch into how to respond to climate change by reducing the impact of biological stressors, reducing the risk and long-term impacts of severe disturbances, all the way down to more transitional ideas like facilitating community adjustments through species transitions, and even realigning an ecosystem following a severe disturbance. Whoops. Now, we don't think that everyone would choose all of these options all the time. Most of the time people do choose mostly resistance and resilience ideas, but we wanted to put those tools out there in case somebody was completely hard hit by a devastating wildfire or wind throw event and felt that it was the time to realign. So don't feel like, again, that we're pushing an agenda here. These are just tools that anyone can use in their land management. So looking at an example, my animation is all messed up here, so I'll just give it to you. An example of somebody who has used the forest menu in their planning. We have plenty, but one that I chose last night was this Florence County, Wisconsin, which is a really interesting project because this is in northern Wisconsin, and they are an example of a group that was experiencing severe mortality and issues related to sort of like the currently observed climate. Like their forests were just rapidly declining due to drought stress. They have sandy soils, also due to invasions of different pests and pathogens like the two-lined chestnut borer. This project, although the stand covers nearly 400 acres, it is is part of a much larger parcel. And in that 400 acres, as much as 90% of the trees in these stands were dead. And then they were like, okay, we need to do something different. Well, how are we going to respond to this challenge? And while we're responding to this challenge in almost a restoration perspective, how can we sort of take into account even more risks just in case, we want to ensure that this isn't going to happen again. So let's think about climate change. This county also has dual certification under the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, SFI, and Forest Stewardship Council, so the FSC. So they're extremely motivated to get this revegetated. So those are the major climate change impacts and those current observed. And when they started looking forward, they were like, well, this area is actually probably prone to experiencing even more drought, especially due to the droughts, the sandy soils. So when they started looking at options, there are a lot of things that they did at this site, and I am only showing really one tactic here. So I'd encourage you to go and read the entire story. But they worked with an organization called the Sustainable Resource Institute and NIACS to consider, different adaptation actions. And they chose to facilitate an adjustment, something new on this landscape by favoring and restoring native species that were expected to adapt to future conditions. They did extensive soil amendments using biochar, wood-based soil amendments like wood ash and biochar, and then heavily trenched this area in order to sort of put that new soil in place, and then ended up planting over 400,000 different trees. Like, this is a huge project. They actually received wildlife Wildlife Conservation Society Adaptation Fund money in 2014 to pay for all of this. But it's a really forward-looking project, and by all accounts, the trees are actually doing okay. Okay, so that was an example of how somebody has used the menu to help, define the intention of their actions. But I'd encourage you to go and check out this menu on your own. So at the Adaptation Workbook website, you can actually go and explore all of the different menus that we have within the Adaptation Workbook. And when you click on one of these strategies, approaches, it'll expand and you'll get to see the full text as well as example tactics. So it's a really cool interactive resource that's available to you, and you should see a button within step 4 that will take you right to this interactive menu. Okay, so really when you think back, forestry and urban forestry are like our classics. It's like the golden oldies. These are our greatest hits. And we have a lot of examples of really interesting projects where people are using both the forestry and urban forestry menu. But you might say, like, why create anything more? Like, you already have the best of the best and you have some great examples. And that's because there's so many different perspectives on the landscape. It would be incredibly ignorant to say that these two resources tell the entire story for how to manage forests in a changing climate. And so after the Forested Watersheds menu was published, we really started to ramp up menu expansion. And you can see we're covering a lot of topics here. And we won't cover all of them today, but I want you just to see how many, this is a continually growing effort, and thanks to our partners for supporting it along the way. Okay, so now we are cruising and we're ready to do example time. In this part of the presentation, I will go into a little bit more detail about each menu. So these are all the adaptation menus. These are actually like clickable links, so you didn't get sick as I was scrolling through my massive slide deck. And so these are linked to the different vignettes about each of the menus. You can see that I have forestry, urban forestry, agriculture, forested watershed, tribal perspectives, which we'll talk about next, forest carbon management, non-forested wetlands, wildlife management, and fire adapted ecosystems. So feel free to look at this and pop into the chat the top 2 menus that you would like me to cover after tribal perspectives. And you'll have one more chance to see this again before Maddie and I just choose for you. Okay, so the tribal adaptation menu. I think some of you in the course, maybe not, I don't know who's here today. Some of you in the course are aware of the menu and are planning to use it. And for the others in the group, I want you to use this time just to think about how this might apply to the communities that you work with, and maybe to think about this as a really interesting resource to bring more people to the table. Okay, so first, need to acknowledge all of those who worked really hard to create this menu. Some of the authors on this have changed affiliations and are actually located outside of the Great Lakes right now, but it's important to share, where they were once when they created this. So the tribal adaptation menu was developed by a pretty diverse group of collaborators representing tribal, academic, intertribal, and government entities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, so mostly Great Lakes. And really, like, the intention of the menu is to provide a framework that can integrate Indigenous and traditional knowledge, culture, and language, and history into the adaptation process. And this menu took a while to create, and all of these people came to the table every single time we had a meeting. So I think it was a year or two. And we only had in-person meetings, and you can see that we have Glyphwick 1854 Treaty Authority, Lac de Flambeau, Michigan Tech, College of Menominee Nation, Red Cliff Band, Northeast Climate Adaptation Center, Intertribal Council of Michigan, and NIACS. And really, this is just the core group. If you were to read the menu, you'll see several other authors listed as well. But these were the core group that were pushing this idea along. Now, I think we're all pretty aware of this, that, climate change is having a huge effect on our environment now, and is only projected to continue disrupting and shifting plant and animal habitats. And this is something that is having a huge effect on Indigenous people, and especially those in the Great Lakes, like the Anishinaabe, who gather, you know, cultural resources because they've been pushed off of their land. They have really very small areas for which they can find their cultural resources. So climate change, affects all of our ecosystems and the beings that are present. But unfortunately, the reality is that some of these beings may shift their range outside of the ceded territory areas where the Ojibwe exercise their treaty rights. And this might mean that those cultural practices become extinct. And it's a really dire and troublesome idea. And it's pretty complicated, and it's it's a hard, people are trying to figure out how to get around this idea. But with the loss of beings, many of the cultural connections to the natural world will be changed and maybe even lost. So one example I wanted to share was that a tribal member expressed concern that the younger generations will never see a snowshoe hare in their backyard, and traditional knowledge and stories about snowshoe hares will maybe become memories and just oral tradition. Collectively, climate change does threaten local plant beings, ecosystems, tribal sovereignty, economy, and culture. So there's a lot here. I should say I had the good fortune of hosting an adaptation workshop where we invited many tribal and Indigenous folks to come, great partners of ours. And they came to work on a project, a wild rice project, and they chose to work on it together. Unfortunately, in that meeting, they got pretty frustrated. And they said, you created a cool resource, but it does nothing to help support our way of life and our values and our culture. And we took it really seriously, and we said, all right, well, we would love to work with you and support you on this journey as we create a new menu that does reflect and is more inclusive of your culture and needs and values. So that's what they did. They said, hey, our traditional and Indigenous knowledge and perspectives aren't being recognized, and there is a gap that needs to be filled. So in 2019, they published the Tribal Adaptation Menu, and you can go and find it on our website, which just connects to another website. And if you need it, just ask me, I can email it to you as well. The menu really was created to provide a resource for incorporating tribal and traditional values into the adaptation workbook. It was created to work with the workbook, but was created also to stand as its own standalone idea. So it has many different ways that it could work, and we're really proud that they wanted to create something that would work within our framework, and we support that, but we also support it being used as a standalone item as well. The menu is really cool. It's designed to be used across the diversity of ecosystems, scales, management contexts, and values. And the authors are just hoping that they created a framework that not only includes traditional and cultural knowledge, but includes opportunity for community members' inputs and more folks to come to the table, like tribal elders, harvesters, the youth, and they hope that this menu provides a platform to promote culturally based management techniques and language. So for those Western folks like I am, this menu is also a really interesting way to bridge communication barriers for non-tribal persons and organizations who are seeking to work with Indigenous approaches. So definitely check this out. Pretty proud of this group. They also won the Climate Adaptation Leadership Award for Natural Resources in 2019, which is a huge honor. Okay, so when you look at the menu, the big focus here is, you know, you'll find that the menu centers on adaptation planning in knowledge that is unique to the perspectives of each Indigenous community and recognizes the connections with natural environment. Another really interesting idea here is language. I mean, I would say the unique focus listed on the slide is language, cultural practices, community engagement, and ecosystems. But language is so present in this menu. And, you know, the authors, they put out there many times that this was written from an Ojibwa and an Anishinaabe and Menominee language, but it's not meant to be the all they're offering this to other tribal nations to include your own language and to interpret these ideas as, you know, make sense for your own culture and community as well. So I know we have some folks from the West, and so this is a Great Lakes centered resource, but the authors would love to work with you if that was something you wanted to help translate so that it made more sense for your community as well and used your own language. Language they wanted to bring the language of parity between human and non-human beings, and the terms used throughout the document are in an attempt to recognize agency and sovereignty of our non-human relations. You can find a big glossary of all of the terms at the end of the document as well. So yeah, it's a really awesome menu. It's pretty big. It's 14 strategies and 60 approaches, but all of them include a ton of example tactics to help you center on you know, what all of that means on the ground. Okay, and so if there's one thing that I want you to do, I want you to open up the tribal adaptation menu and read the guiding principles document. This is a really amazing companion document that describes and details considerations that you might take for working when working with tribal communities. And so the first version of the menu is created based on Ojibwa and Menominee perspectives, languages, concepts, and values, but it was intentionally designed to be adaptable to other Indigenous communities as well. So the guiding principles are just this absolutely amazing document, and it helps to bring you through, you know, the ideas of respect and reciprocity, and can really set you up as a Western-focused person who's trying to understand these Indigenous perspectives. It's a really thoughtful document. When you look at the menu itself, you'll also see that instead of it starting at resistance and moving into transitional ideas, it starts with culturally appropriate strategies. And these are really interesting and they're really amazing. And we ask anyone who is using this menu to start there before you start your brainstorming, because they do address cultural practices, community engagement, and again, reinforce and recognize that human and non-human reciprocal approach. Her relationship, excuse me. So let's look at an example. Okay, so the tribal adaptation menu provides, you know, many strategies and approaches and example tactics. I've just mentioned that. So here, if we take a look at strategy 3, which is supporting tribal engagement in the environment, we see quite a few different approaches. When we choose approach 3.1, this is maintain and revitalize traditional relationships and uses. And really this approach tells us that traditional relationships are a source of strength and are integral to holistic climate adaptation, and that these relationships may be strained and pressured by climate change. And so they are asking that adaptation may involve strengthening and supporting those relationships, you know, coming up with tactics that help us revitalize and maintain our relationship and use on the land. So a possible tactic might be traditional fire practices to encourage blueberry growth. And this photo is taken from a prescribed burn on the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, who only recently, you know, the National Park Service worked with local tribes, and only recently in 2017 began allowing cultural burns. And some say it's been generations since that practice was allowed on this site. And so the practice is not only beneficial to the ways of, of life for the Indigenous people, but also has, you know, incredible benefits for the ecology and ecosystem of this world-renowned ecosystem on the Apostles Islands. So definitely take a look at the menu, get a sense of what it is, and those interconnectivities between how we're doing things. Okay, so in the last slide here, I just wanted to acknowledge that I am not the expert in this topic, and I really encourage you, if you're interested in the menu, to attend an in-person workshop. Look for those authors when they're giving presentations and get to know them. They are amazing experts. If you're going to use the menu, you need to use an offline version, like a Microsoft Word document, in order to document your tactics and how they relate to the menu. You would never, you would not regret going to an in-person workshop. They are phenomenal. Okay, so where are we going, Maddie?
Yeah, so we didn't have too many folks weighing in the chat. So if, as Danielle has put this slide back up, if you want to chat in real quick which ones you'd want to look at next. But so far, I think the most interest was in fire adapted ecosystems.
Let's do it.
Cool.
See if this works. All right, it works. Fire adapted ecosystems. Okay, this is a funny little image I found. This menu is not final. And so every year it gets a little bit better when we're collaborating and working to fine tune it and test it before we publish it. Okay, so the Fire Adapted Ecosystems adaptation menu is authored by, there's many authors, but I would say the idea first came about from the Southwest Fire Climb and Northern Arizona University. They sort of brought the idea to us. They were like, hey, we wrote a menu. And we're like, whoa, cool. So we've been working with them. Our colleague, Courtney Peterson from Colorado State University, and our director, Chris Swanson, have been working with this team to refine and tailor and test. And hopefully we'll have it out there soon enough. And you can learn more about this menu at our website, forestadaptation.org/fire. Now, some big ideas here. Why would you create this menu? Well, there's a lot of evidence that of the wildfires that have occurred, that quite a few more wildfires are probably attributed to conditions that were brought about by climate change. And we know that climate change happens at a much longer time scale, so it's difficult to attribute any singular event to climate change. But looking at the entire record, we start to see some trends. And so in this image here, it's showing that some analysis have found that the areas burned by wildfires across the US between 1984 and 2015 is twice would have burned if climate change had not occurred. And so, there's definitely a preponderance here of evidence that's pointing in the direction that climate change is worsening the wildfires' extent and severity. Another big idea for this menu is after these forests are consumed with fire, we're actually not seeing textbook regeneration. And this is looking at forest regeneration. And so this is a confounding issue. There's a lot of academic research out there that's trying to tease out what's going on. But they do think that in areas that are they're just not seeing trees regenerate in large numbers, and some regeneration may be occurring, but certainly not enough to recreate a forest in the near term. So there's definitely a need for some sort of toolbox for managers who are trying to include climate change in their land management. And that's where we get to the fire menu. And I'll show an example of going through the menu, but first I wanted to show you the strategies. The strategies are really interesting. You can go to the website, go to our easiest to see one is forestadaptation.org/fire, and you can then get redirected to the one in yellow here. But the menu is interactive, so you can click it and it'll expand. But really, most of these ideas are so cool, right? Sustaining fire as a fundamental ecological process. That's, our very typical, this is getting everything back on track strategy. Next, we move into reducing the effects of biotic and abiotic stressors, kind of a resistance idea. But then it really quickly moves into these really innovative and kind of progressive ideas like reducing the risk of unacceptably severe fire, promoting post-fire recovery, maintaining and enhancing species and community diversity. It's a pretty typical idea when you think about prescribed fire. Promoting fire resilient genotypes, I'd like that one. Expected facilitating and adapting the ecosystem so that it is a fire adapted ecosystem, which is a really interesting idea of thinking about different species assemblages and how you can sort of realign that ecosystem so that it's hungry for fire. You can use fire events as an opportunity for ecosystem realignment. You could say, well, old farm field, we didn't know what to do with it anyways. Let's burn it and then put something different there. I don't know. I haven't really dug into that one, but I can imagine that one could be used in some interesting circumstances. And lastly, there's some interesting ideas on the bottom about promoting organizational and operational flexibility when it comes to fire management, sort of being more adaptable, more nimble. And lastly, promoting fire adapted human communities, which is a really interesting flavor and not often something that we see in menus related to society and community. If we look at an example, we'll kick it out with a tactic and go back up. In this example, they want to consider using managed and or prescribed fire to facilitate transition to new fire regimes. They want to use fire to help facilitate a transition in the ecosystem. So they looked at the menu and they found Approach 7.3 applied to them, where they would consider using fire as a tool to align existing veg communities with climate regimes. Sounds really similar to their tactic, right? This is great, great launch board. And as they get up to the top, they see that this was strategy 7, which is elevator pitch, all about facilitating ecosystem adaptation to expected future fire and climate regime, right? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? You could just read the strategy. And lastly, you guessed it, it was a transition approach. They're facilitating change. Okay, that was the quick tour of the fire menu. We probably have time for one more. Give me one more. Give me one more.
I think the only other one someone had chatted in was just forestry and then tribal perspectives, which we did. So feel free to unmute anyone if you see one that agriculture, says
Oh,
Leslie.
I knew it. I knew it. I wasn't going to create this, but then two of you said yesterday you wanted agriculture, so I created an agriculture section. Very typically, this is an example of an adaptation menu where NIACS doesn't typically use that menu, but we were on the core authorship to create this menu. And this was because when the USDA climate hubs were becoming a real entity, they said, well, we need a tool that we can use when we're working with people who are in our audience, just like you have tools for your audience, which is forests. So the other side of the USDA that focuses on agriculture, from NRCS and ARS, which I didn't list here, came together to create this really beautiful adaptation resources for agriculture. And the core idea is that it was developed to assist producers and specialists and technical service providers who are working with farmers, not always just the farmer on their own. Agriculture faces some really some different climate change impacts than we might think about in our setting, but primarily productivity and stress due to weeds and diseases and insect pests. They have a different rotation than we're typically thinking about. This can be an annual cycle of what they're putting on the ground versus when we're thinking about trees, which are on a much longer time scale. And so that annual noise can have a huge impact year to year, whereas we can buffer that in the long-term thinking. So drought and extreme precipitation can just have, it can just decimate an entire farm in one year. You can have intense soil degradation due to one extreme event. And then, issues with acidification, toxification, if you had drought that, held all those chemicals deep into the soils. Climate change will also affect markets year to year, and that can have a huge impact on what the farmer is thinking about in their 1 to 5 year forecast. If you're looking at the menu, you see that has 8 strategies, and it is following the same concept, the same basic idea of how to create a menu from concept, strategy, approach, and then it provides example tactics. These ideas go from resistance to transition, resistance being, reducing stressors on crops and livestock. So maybe an example would be providing shade or providing some sort of cooling mechanism for your livestock, all the way to thinking about weather, really, thinking about reducing risks from warmer and drier conditions. Again, thinking on a much shorter time scale than we're used to thinking about. And but does introduce some transitional ideas like altering systems or lands to new conditions. If they're starting to feel like they're moving into a drought prone time, then maybe they're going to transition their system. Maybe they're on a tension line. Maybe they've always been sort of farming a little south of what they could handle, and so they're going to start to transition that system. If you're looking for real world examples, the climate hubs actually provide quite a few really thorough real world examples, and I would encourage you to go and check those out. And Maddie, that's like an incredibly long URL, but maybe we can put it in a follow up so folks can just click on it. And in my last minute, I wanted to provide an example. So here's an example of a farmer that did use the adaptation workbook, and coincidentally, it's a cider, so it's trees. I chose an example that made more sense to me. So basically, they're looking at a company that makes hard apple cider. They have an extensive orchard, and they're located in the driftless area of Wisconsin, so the western southern side of Wisconsin. 90% of the farmland is for apple production, and the other 10% is cherry, pear, and plum production. And it's home to it's just 2 acres. So it's a small plot, but it's jam-packed full of edible fruits. The climate impacts were undoubtedly, they said that the greatest impacts were the increases in warm temperatures, and then this temperature variation that could occur between January and February that might break the dormancy of apple trees and cause winter kill. And secondly, longer frost-free seasons occurring that would include this erratic temperature swing. And I think we all have heard these stories about that late frost that just ruined, apple production, or even peaches, I think, were affected by a late frost in the last few years. So thinking about that erratic swing and how they could protect their, these trees and the fruit, because the fruit is their economy, they wanted to really focus on reducing the risk and long-term impacts of extreme weather, which was strategy 4. The approach they chose was to reduce the severity or impact of temperature extremes, again, getting back to why they're doing it. And the tactic was they wanted to plant several varieties of different trees that had different flowering times. So maybe some would get hit by that late season frost, while others might still survive. And there's a ton more to the story. So again, you'll want to go and read about this and really get a sense of, they actually have uploaded all of their worksheets, so you can see all of their ideas as well. And lastly, this menu is on the adaptation workbook, and so you can go and check out the interactive version of the menu as well. Okay, and so that is all that I had. I wanted to just share like one last slide, and that is this one. I'm showing my screen, right, Maddie? So it's that don't feel like you need to be boxed in by any one menu. Please mix and match. You might have a project that has urban approaches. You might have a project that also includes agriculture or wildlife. So these are not to be used in isolation. They are meant to be mixed and matched based on the property and the goals that you have. You're very likely going to create actions that are very similar to what you're used to, but maybe make sense in this new context, right? It's using your tools at different times and different scenarios. But like we're all going to do something different. And I like to put this slide up there just to say, just as a reminder, this is a no judgment situation. We're all different, and we're all going to take different actions based on our goals and our values and our time frame and our capacity, right? But we also need to be aware that we're not always going to get what we want, and that we might need to triage and prioritize where we're working on the land and really prioritize the most important, maybe the highest vulnerable places on the landscape when we're choosing what to do. We're probably not going to be able to do everything on every aspect of our ecosystem. Okay, so find more information, go to our website, and that is it. You are free to go, free to stay and ask questions. And if you felt like you wanted more information, we do actually have a recorded video that is in your syllabus that you can watch that goes into more details on urban forests, forest and watersheds, and the wildlife menu. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you for coming today.